The Broken Compass, a crusade without a cause. Let me tell you about a crusade that never reached Jerusalem. A crusade that began with prayers and ended with pillage. One that was meant to liberate the Holy Land, but instead looted the greatest Christian city in the world. The year is 1202. The fires of the Third Crusade have barely cooled. Richard the Lionheart is dead. Saladin too has passed into legend, and Jerusalem remains lost. But in Rome, a new pope rises. His name is Innocent III, young, brilliant, and burning with the conviction that God has called him to do what others could not reclaim the holy city. He issues the call, another crusade, another tide of knights, peasants, and priests drawn by faith, fear, and the promise of redemption. But this time, there is no clear plan, no king to lead them, no funding secured, only the will to fight and the dream of Jerusalem. So they look west, not east, to Venice, the greatest naval power in Europe, a republic of merchants, shipbuilders, and gold. The Crusaders offer a deal: transport us across the sea to Egypt, and we will bring back glory and salvation. Venice agrees, but not without a price the Crusaders cannot pay, and that changes everything. From that moment forward, the Fourth Crusade begins to drift not toward the Holy Land, but toward compromise, coercion, and corruption. The sacred mission becomes something else, something twisted. A voyage not of deliverance, but of debt, of manipulation, of betrayal. And standing at the center of this storm, a blind old man, the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, a man who cannot see, but sees everything. And before the year is out, he will lead an army of Christian knights not into battle with Muslims, but into the heart of Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. This is the story of how a crusade lost its soul, not in blood, but in gold. Though Jerusalem was etched onto every banner and whispered in every vow, the Fourth Crusade took its first wrong turn, not in the sands of the Holy Land, but on the polished marble of Venetian docks. This was not a crusade of kings. There was no Richard, no Barbarossa, no great monarch to command loyalty and wield authority. Instead, it was a gathering of lesser nobles, fueled by piety and desperation, men with holy purpose, but little gold. And in a world where ships do not sail on faith, they needed help. They turned to Venice, Venice merchant queen of the Adriatic. Mistress of commerce and diplomacy saw opportunity, not salvation. The Crusaders proposed a deal: transport us to Egypt, and we will take Jerusalem from the south. The Venetians agreed, with one condition: a staggering price of 85,000 silver marks. It was a sum the Crusaders could never hope to raise. When payment fell short, desperation crept in. Normally, that would have been the end of the crusade, but Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, blind in eyes but not in ambition, made a counteroffer. Venice would forgive the debt if the Crusaders helped them capture Zara, a rebellious Christian city on the Dalmatian coast. Zara, under the protection of the Pope, a city of Christians. To sack it would mean turning their swords not against the infidel, but against fellow followers of Christ. And yet, they agreed. In November 1202, under the very cross that was meant to sanctify, the Crusaders laid siege to Zara. Churches burned, families fled, gold changed hands. The Pope excommunicated them all in outrage, but the Doge suppressed the letter. Most never knew. The crusade had already begun to rot from within. Then came the second temptation. From across the sea, a young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, arrived with a plea. His father, the former emperor, had been deposed and blinded in a coup. Alexios promised, "Restore me to the throne of Constantinople, and I will pay your debts, send troops for your holy war, and reunite the Eastern Orthodox Church with Rome." It was a dream too tempting to refuse. And so, the army that had pledged to free Jerusalem now set its course for Constantinople, not the holy city, but the shining capital of Eastern Christianity. It gleamed on the horizon like a second Rome, its towers piercing the sky, its domes glinting in the sunlight. For nearly 1,000 years, it had stood untouched, protected by its walls, its wealth, and its aura of sanctity. But the Crusaders brought with them no reverence, only promises and swords. They did not know they were about to write the darkest chapter in the history of the cross, not against the crescent moon of Islam, but against their own brothers in faith. And what they would find in Constantinople was not salvation, but seduction and ruin. They marched under the banner of the cross, but already the path beneath their feet was paved with compromise. As the winter of 1202 deepened, the Crusaders found themselves camped in a foreign land, far from Egypt, further still from Jerusalem. Zara had fallen, its churches looted by the very men who had sworn to protect Christendom. And though the excommunication from Pope Innocent III loomed over their souls, few spoke of it aloud. In the cold, among splintered timber and silent cathedrals, they began to rationalize. It was necessary. They told themselves, we had no choice, but necessity is the first thread in a tapestry of betrayal. The Crusades' momentum had stalled. Supplies were low, morale lower. Many Crusaders, disgusted by what had happened at Zara, abandoned the cause and returned home. What remained was a core of knights and soldiers too committed or too indebted to turn back. And then came Alexios. He arrived not as a prince, but as a promise. A boy in exile, heir to the throne of Byzantium, ousted and desperate. His father, Isaac II. Angelus, once emperor of Constantinople, had been betrayed by his own brother. Now, Isaac was blinded and imprisoned, and the empire lay in the hands of a usurper, Alexios III, a man detested even by his people. Alexios the Younger pleaded with the Crusaders, "Restore me, and I will reward you beyond measure. Pay your debts to Venice in full. Join your crusade with Byzantine troops. And most importantly, I will bring the Eastern Church back under Rome's authority." It was a miracle wrapped in a deal. The Church, the Empire, the war in the Holy Land, everything could be made right. All the sins at Zara forgiven, all debts paid, if they simply helped a prince reclaim his throne. But it came with a cost, a march on Constantinople, a Christian city, a sacred city, and not just any city. For 1,000 years, Constantinople had stood as the bastion of the Eastern Roman Empire, the bridge between Europe and Asia, the heart of Orthodox Christianity. Its walls had never been breached. Its libraries held secrets older than kingdoms. Its relics were said to outshine Rome's. To attack it was not just blasphemy, it was civil war. Many crusaders hesitated. Some saw in the proposal a betrayal too great to justify. But others saw gold, power, redemption. A chance to be part of something history would never forget. And the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, saw more than anyone. He saw trade routes reclaimed, rivals eliminated. Venetian power secured not just by commerce, but by crusade. Though blind, he guided the fleet with unmatched precision. When he stood before the Crusader army, an old man draped in armor, voice fierce despite age, he convinced them that their mission still served God, and perhaps it did. Or perhaps God had long stopped watching. In spring of 1203, the fleet sailed. Galleys and warships filled the sea like a second flood, bearing not salvation, but siege. Priests blessed the sails. Knights sharpened blades meant for infidels and now aimed at brothers. Over the horizon rose the spires and domes of Constantinople, still unaware of what approached. The Crusade, once born of piety and pain, had become something else. No longer a journey to Jerusalem, but a gamble on a golden city. and a prayer that God would still follow where the cross now led. As the fleet carved across the blue waters of the Adriatic and into the Aegean, a silence settled over the Crusaders. Not the silence of peace, but of anticipation of unspoken doubts and the weight of what they were about to do. Behind them, Zara smouldered in memory. Ahead lay the shining silhouette of Constantinople, the queen of cities, a place none of them had ever expected to see as enemies. They had taken the cross for Jerusalem. Now they sailed for a city where every dome bore the mark of Christ. But oaths are malleable when molded by debt and desperation. The voyage took weeks. Storms slowed their progress, and sickness crept below deck. Many whispered it was divine punishment. Others blamed Venice, or Alexios, or even the Pope. But when, at last, Constantinople rose from the horizon, its golden domes gleaming, its massive walls stretching across the skyline like the gates of heaven themselves, those whispers turned to awe. None of the Crusaders, not even the veterans of Acre, had seen anything like it. Here was a city forged by emperors, adorned by saints, guarded by sea walls and watchtowers that had never fallen. Its streets were paved with marble, its churches held relics of the apostles, and its scholars preserved the wisdom of the ancients. For Western knights who came from muddy towns and drafty castles, it was not just foreign, it was divine. And yet, they had come to lay siege. Alexios, the young pretender, promised them a hero's welcome. He believed his people would rise up, embrace him, overthrow the usurper Alexios III, and restore his blinded father to the throne. But emperors rise and fall by more than birthright. The people of Constantinople did not forget. They remembered Western arrogance. They remembered how the Normans had sacked Thessalonica years before, how Latins had mocked their traditions, their liturgy, their priests. To them, the Crusaders were not saviors. They were barbarians in holy clothes. When the fleet arrived in June 1203, they anchored outside the walls. Priests aboard ships raised the cross high. Trumpets sounded. Messages were sent ashore. Surrender the usurper. Welcome your rightful prince, and no harm shall come to you. The response from within was thunderous silence. The Crusaders waited and waited, but no revolt came, no gates opened. Instead, the great city braced itself. And so, for the first time in history, an army of Western Christians prepared to assault Constantinople, not as pilgrims, but as invaders. From the towers of Galata to the harbours at the Golden Horn, the defenders took position. Greek fire was loaded into siphons. Archers lined the walls. The Imperial Navy blocked the harbour with chains and steel. The city that had held firm against Arabs, Slavs, and Bulgars now faced a new enemy. Its own faith turned against it. The Crusaders built siege engines, tested ladders, positioned ballistae on floating platforms. They even attempted to scale the sea walls directly from ships, an audacious, almost suicidal maneuver. Under the direction of Doge Dandolo himself, who despite his age and blindness demanded to lead from the front, the Venetians constructed massive siege towers atop their galleys. Old men, knights, and mercenaries alike prepared for a war none had foreseen. The first assault came in July. It was chaos. The Crusaders managed to breach a section of the seawall with the help of Venetian engineering, and a foothold was gained. Panic spread in the city. The usurper, Alexios III, fled, abandoning his throne in the dead of night, with chests of gold and none of the people's love. And so, bizarrely, triumph arrived not through battle, but fear. The gates opened. Alexios IV, young, nervous, wide-eyed, was crowned co-emperor alongside his father Isaac II. The Crusaders entered Constantinople as guests, but their welcome would be short-lived, because promises made in exile are easy, keeping them in the palace of emperors. That's another story, and the price of that story would soon be paid in blood. in betrayal, and in fire that would light the city's skyline like a funeral pyre for Christendom itself. Though they now walked within the walls of Constantinople, the Crusaders did not feel victorious. The great city had not fallen to battle. It had opened its gates to strangers, but the air was heavy, not with celebration, but with tension. The Byzantines looked upon their so-called liberators with suspicion, and the Crusaders looked back with growing resentment. The promises that had brought them here gold, food, soldiers, the unification of the churches remained, for the moment, just that promises. Alexios IV, now co-emperor, quickly discovered the crown weighed heavier than he had imagined. His father's eyes had been taken by betrayal, and now Alexios was surrounded by men who mistrusted him as a pawn of the Latins. Every order he gave was questioned. Every coin he spent stirred outrage, and he had to pay. The Crusaders began to demand what was owed. Venice wanted its silver. The knights wanted their reward. Alexios tried, he raised taxes, looted treasures from the churches, melted sacred icons, and even seized relics to satisfy his debts. But the more he gave the Latins, the more his own people turned against him. Riots broke out. Fires lit the night sky. The city's ancient mosaics were torn down not by invaders, but by its own citizens, furious at what their emperor had become a puppet of the West. Inside the palaces, the Crusaders began to grow uneasy. They were still far from Jerusalem. Their ships had not been repaired. Their coffers were running dry. And now they stood surrounded by enemies, not heathens, but fellow Christians, men who looked at them with the same hatred they once reserved for Saracens. It was not long before the uneasy alliance collapsed. In January 1204, a palace coup swept Alexios IV from power. He was imprisoned, then murdered. A new emperor rose, Alexios IV Ducas, known as Mortzouphlos, a man of strength, cunning, and seething hatred for the Latins. He declared the Crusaders enemies of the empire. He closed the gates. He fortified the walls. He readied the city for war. And the Crusaders, surrounded, betrayed, and now truly without options, made a decision. They would take the city, not as allies, but as conquerors. No more promises, no more negotiations, no more diplomacy. Constantinople's seat of emperors, heart of Eastern Christianity, was about to face its darkest hour. And so, what began as a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem became a siege of the greatest Christian city on earth, a siege that would shake the very foundation of Christendom and leave scars that would never heal. They had come for salvation. Now they stood in the shadow of ruin. By the spring of 1204, the Crusaders camped outside the walls of Constantinople were no longer pilgrims, no longer knights in God's army. They were mercenaries without pay, heretics in the eyes of the Pope, and enemies to a city that had once been their ally. The silk-clad merchants of the Queen of Cities now spat curses at their Latin liberators. And deep inside every Crusader's soul, a question lingered like a splinter beneath the skin. What were we doing here? The city before them was not filled with Saracens. It was not a fortress of heretics or pagans. It was a Christian capital, adorned with crosses, echoing with the chants of priests, perfumed with incense from 1,000 holy places. And yet, the siege engines were being built. Ropes were pulled taut. Siege towers were wheeled toward the golden walls. A crossroads had been reached. There would be no turning back. Inside the city, Alexios V Mortzouphlos braced for war. Unlike his predecessor, he had no illusions about appeasing the Latins. He fortified the gates. He rallied his people. He summoned the fury of a humiliated empire, one that had once ruled from the Balkans to the Euphrates, now brought low by betrayal and greed. In the Crusader camps, leaders met beneath flapping tents and flickering torchlight. They argued, they prayed, some wept, but the decision had been made. Constantinople would fall, not for glory, not for God, but because they had no other way forward. The Fourth Crusade, once imagined as a righteous march to Jerusalem, had now completed its transformation. It had become a war not of redemption, but of necessity, not for Christ, but for coin. And as April approached, the Latin banners were raised, the horns of siege were blown, and the world held its breath, because what was about to unfold was no longer a war between East and West. It was the unraveling of Christendom itself. The holiest city in the East would become the victim of the holiest cause in the West, and neither faith, nor history, nor heaven itself would ever forget what came next. To understand the weight of what was about to happen, you must first understand what Constantinople meant, not to the Crusaders, not to the Greeks, but to Christendom itself. This was not a mere city. This was the living air of Rome, where emperors once wore purple stitched in gold thread, where saints walked beneath mosaics that glittered like stars, where scripture was copied by firelight and debated by scholars who had memorized both Greek and Latin. In its libraries were secrets the West had forgotten. In its chapels, relics from the time of Christ, the robe of the Virgin Mary, a piece of the true cross, the lance that pierced Christ's side. These were not treasures, they were fragments of heaven. But heaven had turned its face away. For the citizens of Constantinople, the arrival of the Latin army had been a humiliation, then a threat, and now an apocalypse. Fathers trained sons to hold spears. Mothers hid silver in bread loaves and whispered prayers in the night. Priests, once neutral, now stood beside soldiers. No one trusted anyone. The city was a powder keg, and all it lacked was a spark. That spark would come from within the Crusader camp. By now, the unity of the Latin army had begun to fracture. Some lords wanted to cut their losses and return home. Others still dreamed of marching to Jerusalem, if only the city before them would yield. And among the Venetians, there was talk quiet but growing that perhaps this had been their goal all along. Not salvation, not penance, but profit. Doge Enrico Dandolo, old and blind, never once faltered in his resolve. He moved among the camp like a ghost in armor, half prophet, half banker, insisting that the assault must go forward. He told the men that Constantinople held enough wealth to pay every soldier twice over, that inside those walls were riches untouched for centuries, and more importantly, he said, we will be remembered. That promise of wealth, of immortality, of finally justifying the suffering and sins of the journey was too sweet to resist. By now, the papal excommunication was common knowledge, but no one cared. The Pope was in Rome. The gold was in Constantinople, and so the final preparations began. Siege engines were reinforced with stolen timber. Catapults were dragged closer to the sea walls. Ships were outfitted with boarding ramps and siege towers, turning the harbour into a floating battlefield. Latin priests blessed the army one last time. Knights kissed crucifixes. Archers dipped arrows in oil. But behind every ritual, every sermon, was the grim, inescapable truth. They were about to burn the house of God to the ground, and for what a throne that did not belong to them. A treasure that could not buy back their lost honor. A victory that history would remember not as holy, but as heresy. The Fourth Crusade had left behind its purpose long ago. It now sailed beneath the banner of a lie, but that banner still fluttered in the wind, still bore the cross, still promised salvation, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was the cruelest irony of all. Because in the days to come, those same banners would be carried through the broken gates of Constantinople, and behind them came the storm. Night before the storm, the wind from the Bosporus whispered along the decks of anchored ships, rattling armor, swaying siege ladders, and carrying the scent of oil and salt into every corner of the Crusader encampment. Fires flickered low in the darkness, ringed by anxious faces, young squires reciting psalms, grizzled knights sharpening blades that had once been consecrated for the Holy Land. Now, they would be stained with Christian blood. The city loomed just across the water, magnificent and unknowable. From a distance, Constantinople still looked like paradise. Its domes shimmered beneath the moon, and the distant toll of church bells echoed like a warning from heaven. But the men on the shore no longer felt wonder. They felt dread, hunger, rage, and resolve. Many tried to sleep, but few succeeded. Some drank, some prayed. Some whispered of omens and eclipse a week past. A dog found hanged from a tree. A monk who wandered the camp saying only 3 words, "Blood will baptize." No one knew what it meant, but everyone felt it. They had crossed a line, somewhere between Zara and Byzantium, and now there was no return. Their souls were already burdened with too much sin. The best they could hope for now was justification, a victory so grand it would force the church and perhaps even God himself to forgive them. And still, despite everything, they believed that this was somehow still a crusade, that the cross on their chests still mattered, that the city across the water, for all its holiness, had to fall for a greater good. But within Constantinople, the faithful prepared differently. The people already weary from decades of political corruption and betrayal now faced the unimaginable siege, not by Turks or Arabs, but by their own brothers in faith. The emperor, Alexios V, had turned the city into a fortress. Greek fire was prepared in vats. Every tower was manned. Every church was filled with frightened worshippers who prayed for a miracle, but prepared for martyrdom. In the monasteries, scrolls were hidden in vaults. Relics were locked in stone boxes and buried beneath chapels. Some priests whispered to one another, "If the Latins breach the walls, they will take our saints." And they were right. But not even the most fearful, not even the most cynical, could imagine what would come. Not just looting, not just war, but a desecration, a wound in the body of Christendom that would never heal. Yet for now, all was quiet. One final breath before the plunge, as dawn crept across the sky, casting long shadows over the masts and walls. A horn sounded, one note, low, trembling, then another, and another, and then a roar. From ships and siege towers, from tents and ramparts, from tongues speaking French, German, Italian, and Latin, it rose like thunder across the harbour. The Crusaders moved. Their armour glinted in the morning sun. Their banners waved, still bearing the cross. And as the first arrows flew and the engines of war groaned to life, a silence deeper than death settled over the souls of those watching from within the walls. This was not a crusade anymore. This was a reckoning. The first charge began at sunrise. The waters of the Golden Horn churned with oars and war cries as Venetian ships surged forward, their prows bearing not trade goods, but towers' massive wooden siege ramps mounted on decks, tall enough to meet the city walls. Arrows rained down from Constantinople's defenders like a storm of black needles. But the Crusaders pressed on. They had come too far to retreat now. From the landward side, ladders were thrown against the ancient Theodosian walls. Latin knights, clad in mail and desperation, clawed upward one rung at a time. For every man who reached the top, 2 fell. Screams echoed off stone. The cries of horses, the clash of steel, the shouts of commanders trying to make order out of chaos. It all merged into a single roar of battle. Above it all, Constantinople stood defiant. Its banners purple and gold snapped in the wind. Its bells rang with panic and prayer. The mosaics of saints and angels, untouched for centuries, watched silently as their city burned. Incense mixed with smoke. Latin chants rose in competition with Greek liturgies. The cross was on both sides now, and in that moment, it meant nothing. There were no longer sides of righteousness and sin, only attackers and defenders, only the desperate and the doomed. The Doge of Venice, old and blind, stood at the bow of his flagship as it crashed against the sea walls. His banner, a lion with wings, rose beside the cross. His voice rang out across the harbour, to Constantinople, for God, for gold, for glory. And behind him, men obeyed. What happened next would be remembered not in triumph, but in trembling. The walls did not fall that day, but they cracked. And inside that crack, the future began to bleed. The last prayers of monks, the shattering of statues, the keening of women and children who knew what siege meant. These were not moments of war. They were the first shadows of something worse, of a betrayal so deep it would divide the Christian world for centuries. But that was tomorrow's story. For now, as the sun dipped behind the domes and firelight danced along the battlements, the Fourth Crusade camped once again beneath the walls of Constantinople. Their armor was dented, their swords bloodied, but their hearts still beat with the illusion that what they were doing was holy. And perhaps that was the greatest tragedy of all. That night, no one slept. The air was heavy with the scent of ash and iron. Across the water, Constantinople's walls flickered with the glow of torches, hundreds, maybe thousands, each one marking a soldier ready to defend his home. The city was not silent. It groaned under the weight of dread and defiance. From the churches, midnight prayers rang out. Women huddled in candlelit chapels, clutching icons, weeping beneath mosaics of saints that once promised protection. Now they begged for it. Outside the walls, the Crusaders prepared. The siege towers were repaired, the ships rearmed. Knights paced like lions in cages, their minds clouded with a strange mixture of holiness and hunger. What began as a vow at the foot of a cathedral had become a debt to be paid in blood. And deep in their hearts, many began to wonder not if they would win, but what it would mean if they did. Because there was no longer any doubt they would attack a Christian city, a city that had never denied Christ. A city filled with the relics they themselves revered, and yet the order would come. Soon, in the command tents, maps of the city were spread wide. Generals argued. Priests gave blessings with trembling hands. Some whispered that the Pope would never forgive them. Others said that God himself would understand that the empire had lost its way, that this was a correction, a divine punishment. But no one truly believed that anymore. They just needed to believe something. And then, as if history itself took a breath, the bells of Hagia Sophia rang out one last time before war. They echoed not just across stone and sea, but across time. Because what came next would not just be a battle. It would be the moment when the crusade, the idea of it, the hope of it, the myth of it, shattered. And when it did, those shards would cut deeper than any sword. Venice's bargain trade, treason, and a new target. The Crusaders had come to Constantinople as saviors, but they stayed as occupiers. After their first assault had been beaten back, they returned to camp not defeated, but determined. Inside the city, panic festered. The betrayal of Alexios IV, the rise of the hardline Alexios V, and the murders in the palace had sealed the fate of an already fractured alliance. There would be no more negotiations. The city had chosen defiance. And now, the Crusaders chose war. But it wasn't just war anymore. It was vengeance. They had risked everything, crossed continents, sacked Zara, sacrificed honor for a promise made by a prince now lying dead in an imperial crypt. The empire had taken their gold, spat on their banners, and shut them out. To the Latins, it was not just a failed mission, it was a theft, and the Venetians, they saw something more, the ultimate prize. Venice had always been a republic of merchants, its doge more banker than king. Its fleets built not just for war, but for profit. Now, with Constantinople weakened and divided, Venice saw a chance to do what no Western power had ever done, seize the richest city in Christendom. And so a new deal was struck not with an emperor, but between Crusader and Venetian. If they took the city, they would split it, its gold, its palaces, its churches, even its empire. The great Christian capital would be divided like spoils of war carved up not for Christ, but for commerce. The new plan was bold, reckless, heretical, but it was unanimous. The Fourth Crusade would no longer even pretend to seek Jerusalem. Its new holy land was Constantinople itself. And as spring bloomed in 1204, the final assault began. Ships battered the sea walls with iron rams. Siege towers were rolled forward on greased logs. Ballistae hurled stones into markets and monasteries. The defenders fought valiantly, pouring boiling oil from battlements, unleashing Greek fire in terrifying bursts. But they were outnumbered, outmatched, and surrounded by betrayal. Then, on April 12th, the gates broke and hell entered the city. The morning of April 12th, 1204, dawned blood red, as if the heavens themselves were warning the world to look away. But no one looked away. The sea walls of Constantinople had cracked under the relentless assault. Venetian galleys rammed the harbour defences, and siege towers mounted on ships finally gained a foothold atop the walls. On the landward side, Crusader knights poured through a breach, their swords wet with the blood of defenders who had prayed to the same god. Smoke curled above the palaces, and the bells of the city, those ancient guardians of the faithful, began to ring, not for salvation, but for surrender. And still, the Latin army came on. What followed was not battle, it was desecration. They stormed through the streets, knights and foot soldiers alike, unmoored from command, swept up in a frenzy of lust, hunger, and vengeance. They looted homes, broke into chapels, shattered altars with their boots. Gold was ripped from icons, chalices taken from trembling priests. In the heart of Christendom's jewel, the language of conquest was no longer Latin or Greek. It was fire, steel, and screams. The Venetians, once merchants, became something else entirely. They had not come merely to fight, they had come to claim. Whole districts were marked off, ships loaded with priceless relics and treasures that had adorned Constantinople for centuries. Horses were stabled in the great basilicas. The famed bronze horses of the hippodrome gifts from an earlier Rome were taken down, packed in crates, and sent west. You can still see them today, in Venice. And in Hagia Sophia, Christendom's greatest church, a cathedral built to echo the glory of heaven, Latin soldiers broke the altar, slaughtered those who sought sanctuary, and brought a prostitute to dance upon the throne of the patriarch. The smoke from the burning libraries mingled with incense. The blood ran along mosaics that had witnessed emperors crowned and saints venerated. The loot flowed like wine, and none could stop it. Not even the Doge, not even God. For 3 days, Constantinople endured this. 3 days of holy men defiled, of children stolen, of nuns raped, of books older than memory reduced to ash. And when the violence finally burned itself out, what remained was not victory. It was a scar, one so deep it split the church itself. For centuries, Latin and Greek Christians had argued, yes, about theology, about doctrine, about primacy. But this was a knife to the heart. The Orthodox would never forget, never forgive. Rome had sent knights to reclaim Jerusalem. Instead, they had destroyed the Second Rome, and in doing so, They had unleashed something that would echo far beyond the ruins. A permanent fracture, a schism deeper than doctrine, a rage passed down in blood and memory, altar to altar, generation to generation. The crusade was over. The cross had conquered, but at what cost and for whom? When the fires died and the screams gave way to silence, Constantinople no longer resembled the city that had once been the envy of Christendom. Its palaces were hollow, its churches defiled, its libraries, once filled with the collected wisdom of 1,000 years, were now ash drifting on the breeze. The scent of incense still clung to the air, mingled with charred wood, blood, and the rot of corpses unburied in the streets. The Queen of Cities had been violated not by heathens, not by the infidels of the East, but by those who claimed to serve the same God. And in the ruins, the victors began to divide their spoils. The Fourth Crusade, having failed every objective it once claimed to uphold, crowned a new emperor, Baldwin of Flanders. He was not Roman, he did not speak Greek, but he was now, by sword and decree, the emperor of what remained. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was declared an unnatural creation, born of greed and violence, a Western mask draped over a shattered Eastern corpse. Venice, ever calculating, took more than land. It took ports, islands, trade routes. Its prize was not thrones, but commerce. The Doge returned home not with banners, but with contracts. Statues, relics, and riches flowed into Venice, transforming the merchant republic into a gleaming monument of stolen sanctity. But the Latin Empire was a ghost from the beginning. The Byzantine nobility, those who had fled the slaughter, re-established splinter states in exile, in Nicaea, in Epirus, in Trebizond. Each claimed to be the true heir of the Eastern Roman legacy. Each vowed to retake Constantinople, and the people those not killed or enslaved now lived under Latin rule as second-class citizens in their own ancestral home. The city never recovered its soul. Though Latin rulers tried to impose order, the Orthodox Church refused submission. Monks vanished into the hills. Icons were hidden. Liturgy returned to whispers. What could not be destroyed was buried deep in memory. And across the Christian world, the reaction was mixed. In Rome, Pope Innocent III wept not for the city, but for the sin. He had not ordered this. He had condemned it, but it had happened in the name of the cross. And though the Pope would later try to justify the conquest, claiming it had reunited the churches, it was a lie. A hollow salve on a festering wound. The Orthodox Christians of the East saw only one truth: they had been betrayed by their brothers, and Christendom had devoured itself. What followed the coronation of Baldwin of Flanders was not peace, but a masquerade of empire. The Latin Empire, born from conquest, claimed to be the new Byzantium, yet it was a hollow imitation. The Latin knights who had once dreamed of Jerusalem now squabbled over titles and tracts of ruined land. The Venetians took the choicest ports and islands, turning the Aegean into a maritime marketplace under their flag. Constantinople itself gutted. Resentful became an occupied city, filled with soldiers who couldn't speak its language or understand its soul. Baldwin tried to rule, but his authority ended at the walls. Beyond, the shattered remnants of the old Byzantine aristocracy plotted and prepared. In Nicaea, Theodore Lascaris rallied survivors. In Epirus, Michael Komnenos carved out his own realm. And in Trebizond, the distant branch of the imperial family declared a rival court on the Black Sea. Each swore vengeance. Each claimed to be the true guardian of Orthodox faith and Roman legacy. Meanwhile, the common people of Constantinople lived in a shadow world. Their churches now spoke Latin. Their rites were suppressed. Their relics were gone. But their memory was unbroken. In secret chapels and ruined monasteries, they passed down the story of the sack of the fire, of the Latin banners in Hagia Sophia, of the blood on the altar steps. And they waited. They waited through the years of Latin decline, through failed campaigns, through famine, through betrayal, even among the Western lords themselves. The Crusaders had won the city, but not its soul. They had broken the empire, but not the identity that bound its people to 1,000 years of faith, ritual, and resistance. By the time Pope Innocent III died in 1216, the Latin Empire was already bleeding from within. Its rulers were distant. Its enemies were growing. And its people, those who had once sung hymns beneath golden domes, now whispered prayers for liberation. The sack of Constantinople had won no holy relics. It had healed no schism. It had crowned no just king. It had only proven one thing, that the greatest danger to Christendom came not from without, but from within. From the cross, when it was wielded like a sword. From faith, when it was twisted by gold. And from oaths, when they were traded for empire. Though Latin banners fluttered from the towers of Constantinople, they could not cover the silence. A silence not of peace, but of exhaustion, of something sacred that had been broken beyond repair. The Crusaders tried to convince themselves they had brought order, that their conquest had ended heresy and fulfilled the will of God. Priests from the West gave Latin sermons in gutted churches. The relics of saints were paraded as trophies. Baldwin sat on the imperial throne, flanked by Venetian merchants and Flemish knights. But outside the palace walls, the truth could not be dressed in gold. The people of the city, those who had not fled or died, moved through the ruins like ghosts. Every alleyway reminded them of what had been lost. The city's spirit was not in its walls or domes. It had lived in the liturgy, the memory, the rhythm of life that had stretched unbroken since Constantine himself founded the city as the New Rome. Now that rhythm was shattered. Even the Crusaders began to sense it. Their victory brought no songs, no joyous returns, no tide of letters to families telling tales of honor. Instead, they stayed guarding a city that hated them, surrounded by enemies who called themselves Christians too. They grew bitter, greedy, paranoid. Many returned home with stolen goods, but found no glory awaiting them. Venice, meanwhile, became rich, richer than ever before. Its docks overflowed with Byzantine art, scripture, stone, and silk. The treasures of a fallen empire became the adornments of a republic of traders. And yet, in the East, every coin of Venetian silver became a symbol of betrayal. The Orthodox world would not forget. Not in a generation. Not in 1,000 years. In the hills of Anatolia, monks rewrote their gospels, inserting curses for the Latin invaders. In hidden mountain churches, icons were painted with sorrowful eyes, saints bleeding. Christ depicted not triumphant, but betrayed. Children grew up with tales of the sack not as history, but as living memory. And across the Muslim world, there was laughter. Because while the Christians tore each other apart, the gates to Jerusalem remained closed. The holy city that had been the goal of the Crusade had never even seen a Latin banner. Instead, it watched as the greatest Christian empire in the East collapsed from within. The Fourth Crusade had been hijacked by greed, by Venice's ambition, by the failure of Christendom to look inward before it lashed outward. And in its failure, it planted seeds that would bloom into darker ages, into more wars, more division, and eventually into the fall not just of Constantinople, but of Rome itself. But that part of the story still lay in shadow. For now, the fires smouldered, and the ghosts of Byzantium began to gather. The days after the sack were filled not with triumph, but with rot. Rot in the streets, where bodies still lay unburied beneath shattered columns and broken icons. Rot in the palaces, where Crusader lords now dined off plates stolen from altars. Rot in the heart of an empire that once claimed to be the guardian of Christian civilization. Constantinople did not recover, it merely endured. Baldwin of Flanders, crowned emperor in the Hagia. Sophia, now stripped of its gold and filled with smoke stains, quickly realized that conquest was simpler than governance. He spoke no Greek. He trusted only his own men. And the city he ruled saw him not as a savior, but as a barbarian in a borrowed throne. Every decision he made fed the fires of resentment. Every tax, every law, every Latin bishop installed in place of Orthodox clergy was another stone removed from the already crumbling foundation. His empire was a mosaic of jagged shards. To the west, Venice carved out its rewards Crete, Euboea, the Aegean Isles territories that became fortified trade hubs. Their galleys brought home stolen relics and Byzantine silk, but their presence made them a target too. Pirates flourished, local lords rebelled. The Byzantines who had fled to Nicaea and Epirus began to strike back. To the east, the Seljuk Turks watched closely. They had been the great adversaries of Christendom. Now, they observed as Christendom devoured itself. They pressed at the borders, raided with impunity, and whispered alliances with Greek warlords who would rather make pacts with the Sultan than bow to a Latin emperor. The Orthodox world was not dead. It was in exile, and in that exile, it grew harder, sharper, more determined. In Nicaea, Theodore Lascaris did what Baldwin could not rebuild. He restored schools, reopened churches, revived the traditions that had been torn from Constantinople. In his court, Greek priests chanted the same hymns their ancestors had sung beneath Justinian's dome. His soldiers swore oaths not to God and glory, but to vengeance. They would return. They would rebuild the empire, not as it had been, but as it should have been, cleansed of foreign domination, and they would not forgive. So while the Latins celebrated, a storm was gathering, not of Turks, not of Mongols, but of Byzantines humbled, scattered, but not broken. And one day, that storm would sweep the Latin Empire from the map and wash the stain of betrayal in fire. As the fires dimmed and the echoes of battle faded, a strange quiet fell over Constantinople. Not peace, never peace, just silence. The kind that comes after a scream, the kind that lingers in churches where no incense burns, where the icons stare down at shattered pews and broken altars, the kind that fills streets once bustling with philosophers and pilgrims, now choked with ash, bones, and the heavy footfalls of foreign boots. Latin soldiers, many of them veterans of years on the road, now wandered a city they didn't understand. They carried relics stuffed into sacks, crossed themselves before mosaics they couldn't read, drank wine from goblets meant for communion. They had won, but there was no celebration, only division, suspicion, and an unspoken sense that something irreversible had happened here. They had conquered a city, but lost the cause. In the deeper quarters of the city, survivors mourned not with tears, but in silence. Greek priests refused to speak Latin. Monks who had escaped the slaughter gathered in secret chapels, reading liturgy by candlelight. Women wept in the ruins of their homes, where the walls still bore soot from torched libraries. Children asked when the empire would come back, and the old men said nothing. They had seen too much. To them, this was not just defeat, it was the apocalypse, the final breach in the promise of Christian brotherhood. The sack of Constantinople had not just broken an empire, it had unmasked the cross, showed it not as a symbol of shared faith, but as a weapon used by those who were supposed to be allies. And though the Pope would write letters of rebuke, and the Crusaders would pen chronicles painting themselves as reluctant conquerors, the truth was undeniable. The Crusade had become a curse. And Constantinople, once the bridge between East and West, was now the tombstone of unity. There was no more story to tell, only consequence. As months passed, the illusion of the Latin Empire began to rot from the inside. What had been built on blood could not be held with banners alone. Baldwin of Flanders, once hailed as the new Roman emperor, found himself trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by Byzantine subjects who loathed him, by Venetian partners who outmaneuvered him, and by rival Crusader lords who whispered of carving their own fiefdoms from the corpse of the city. The unity that had stormed Constantinople fractured as quickly as it had formed. Italian quarrels flared with French ambitions. German knights resented the Venetian dominance of trade. Mercenaries demanded their pay. Priests argued over rites in hollowed-out cathedrals that still stank of blood and soot. And beneath their feet, Constantinople waited. The people endured Latin rule with clenched teeth. Their voices were not heard in councils. Their churches were stripped of language, of saints, of song. In monasteries hidden beyond the walls, Orthodox monks rewrote the Psalms to lament the day the West came wearing the cross and wielding the blade. In homes, mothers taught their children to kneel, not before the Latin priests, but toward the east, where the true church had fled. Resistance simmered, not in open revolt, but in memory. And meanwhile, outside the ruined gates, the real Byzantium began to awaken. In Nicaea, Lascaris sent envoys to old allies, forged marriage pacts, recruited from among the Orthodox faithful who had survived the sack. In Epirus and Trebizond, warlords declared themselves successors to Rome, not in ambition, but in defiance. They swore oaths to reclaim Constantinople, not for pride, but for the soul of the empire. And so, as spring warmed the broken marble of the Queen of Cities, a new campaign began, not one of steel, but of remembrance. The sack was not the end. It was the wound. And as every healer knows, wounds may scab, but they also scar. As months passed, the illusion of the Latin Empire began to rot from the inside. What had been built on blood could not be held with banners alone. Baldwin of Flanders, once hailed as the new Roman emperor, found himself trapped in a gilded cage surrounded by Byzantine subjects who loathed him, by Venetian partners who outmaneuvered him, and by rival Crusader lords who whispered of carving their own fiefdoms from the corpse of the city. The unity that had stormed Constantinople fractured as quickly as it had formed. Italian quarrels flared with French ambitions. German knights resented the Venetian dominance of trade. Mercenaries demanded their pay. Priests argued over rites in hollowed-out cathedrals that still stank of blood and soot. And beneath their feet, Constantinople waited. The people endured Latin rule with clenched teeth. Their voices were not heard in councils. Their churches were stripped of language, of saints, of song. In monasteries hidden beyond the walls, Orthodox monks rewrote the Psalms to lament the day the West came wearing the cross and wielding the blade. In homes, mothers taught their children to kneel not before the Latin priests, but toward the east, where the true church had fled. Resistance simmered, not in open revolt but in memory. And meanwhile, outside the ruined gates, the real Byzantium began to awaken. In Nicaea, Lascaris sent envoys to old allies, forged marriage pacts, recruited from among the Orthodox faithful who had survived the sack. In Epirus and Trebizond, warlords declared themselves successors to Rome, not in ambition, but in defiance. They swore oaths to reclaim Constantinople, not for pride, but for the soul of the empire. And so, as spring warmed the broken marble of the Queen of Cities, a new campaign began, not one of steel, but of remembrance. The sack was not the end. It was the wound. And as every healer knows, wounds may scab, but they also scar. By the end of that brutal year, Constantinople had become a city of shadows. Not just the physical ruins, though, those were everywhere. Burned markets, broken statues, churches without roofs, homes that had once echoed with Byzantine psalms now sat hollow, occupied by foreign tongues and foreign hands. But the real ruin was quieter. It was in the silence of the priests who refused to serve under Latin bishops, in the eyes of children taught to bow before invaders while hearing whispered tales of imperial ancestors, in the slow, aching grief of a people who walked daily past looted churches and remembered the day their Christ had been crucified not by infidels, but by fellow Christians. For the Greeks of Constantinople, every street was a grave, every dome a lie, every morning a struggle not to forget, but to endure. And for the Latins, they could not understand why the city did not rejoice, why their empire felt like a tomb, why their wealth brought no peace, their victory no honor. Some returned west with wagons of gold and holy relics and found themselves branded as looters, not heroes. Others stayed, growing sick in the eastern heat, dying by the dozens from disease, rebellion, and despair. And those who lived saw something worse. They saw the truth, that they had traded the dream of Jerusalem for the ashes of Constantinople, that they had lifted the cross as a banner and used it to tear down a church more ancient than their own, that they had broken something they could never rebuild, and in their failure, they had created something new, not an empire, not a kingdom, but a ghost, a wound that would linger for centuries, a city that would remember. The Latin Empire, from its first breath, was already dying. In the palaces once home to Byzantine emperors, Crusader lords argued not about rebuilding, but about division of lands, of loot, of titles. They understood conquest, not governance. They had no idea how to rule a world older and more complex than their own, and while they dressed themselves in the purple robes of old, the people saw through the costume. To the Greeks, they were not emperors, they were invaders. To the priests, they were not protectors, they were desecrators. And to the memory of Byzantium, they were nothing but dust pretending to be marble. Outside the city walls, the world shifted. The Seljuk Turks grew bolder. The Bulgarian Empire watched with sharpened knives. The Nicaeans, the Byzantines who had escaped, strengthened their new court and whispered war. The Latin Empire had no allies. It had no legitimacy. It had only what it could hold by sword, and even that was slipping. In the streets of Constantinople, life tried to go on. Vendors returned to broken stalls. Bells rang in Latin, but few listened. In hidden monasteries, the true liturgy continued in hushed voices. Saints were painted anew now with eyes red from weeping, robes torn by grief. Old women crossed themselves and taught the names of the emperors who had once walked these avenues with glory. Children were born under occupation. They never knew the empire that had stood for 1,000 years, but they inherited its sorrow, its memory, its fire. Because Byzantium was never just a place. It was a belief that Rome could live again, purified by faith, shaped by wisdom, held aloft not by conquest, but by divine order. That belief did not die in 1204. It went underground. It became a heartbeat in exile, a drumbeat in Nicaea, a vow in Epirus, a prophecy in Trebizond. The Latin Empire had burned the body of Byzantium, but the soul had fled, and it would return. The coronation of Baldwin in Hagia Sophia was meant to be the dawn of a new age. Instead, it became a funeral. He wore the imperial diadem, stood beneath the ruined dome, and proclaimed himself Emperor of the Romans. But even as the Latin clergy chanted in triumph, the echoes did not reach the people. In the courtyards, in the alleys, behind half-collapsed colonnades, the citizens of Constantinople knelt not in joy, but in resignation. They had seen emperors before. Baldwin was not one of them. He could not speak their tongue. He did not know their saints. And though he sat on the same throne that had borne the weight of Justinian, Basil, and Alexios, he had none of their lineage, none of their grace. The ceremony was not a coronation, it was a charade. Even the Latin nobles sensed it. Some had come to the east for Jerusalem, others for vengeance. Few had dreamed of ending their journey here ruling over people who hated them, guarding ruins whose bricks still radiated heat from the fires they themselves had lit. And so the court fractured. The Venetians consolidated power over the ports. The French and Flemings claimed fiefs in the countryside. Rivalries turned to bloodshed. Every petty lord wanted a palace. Every knight a fortress. But Constantinople had no more to give. It had been gutted. The people starved, trade dried up, enemies circled, and the old empire scattered. Wounded began to stir. In Nicaea, men whispered, "The city will rise again." In Epirus, swords were sharpened. In Trebizond, ships were built, banners sown, and the double-headed eagle of Byzantium was unfurled once more. The Latin Empire had taken a city, but it had not killed the idea. And ideas, when fueled by exile and memory, do not fade. They grow, they burn, they come back. The empire of Ash-Latin thrones and Byzantine ghosts. The Latin Empire was built on fire and crowned in silence. From the outside, it looked like triumph. A Western emperor seated on an Eastern throne. Latin bishops in Orthodox churches. Crusader banners flying over the walls of the most storied city in Christendom. But inside the walls, inside the palaces, inside the hearts of the people, it was a ruin held together by fear. Baldwin of Flanders ruled in name only. His empire was a patchwork of grudges, Venetians ruling trade like tyrants, French lords carving up noble estates as if slicing bread, German knights fighting not the enemy, but each other. Every baron imagined himself the next emperor. Every soldier demanded land, gold, or blood. And in every alley of Constantinople, the people waited. They did not rebel. Not yet. But their eyes followed every foreign patrol. Their prayers to the saints grew sharper. Their songs, in secret, remembered emperors and victories lost. They kept the liturgy of the past alive in whispers, in basements, in ruins where only pigeons now roosted, and Christ still wept from cracked mosaics. Outside the city, the world darkened. To the north, the Bulgarian Empire saw an opportunity. To the east, the Seljuk Turks watched with quiet satisfaction. But the truest threat, the one the Latins ignored, grew in exile. The Empire of Nicaea, forged by the survivors of the sack, led by Theodore Lascaris. Nicaea became not just a place of refuge, but of purpose. While the Latin Empire decayed under the weight of its own greed, Nicaea rebuilt what mattered: faith, culture, governance, identity. Its soldiers trained with discipline. Its priests preached unity. Its citizens believed, not in revenge alone, but in restoration. Because while the Latin rulers wore crowns of gold, the Nicaeans bore something heavier: the memory of what was stolen, and the vow to reclaim it. The Latin Empire decayed not with a bang, but with 1,000 quiet betrayals. From the moment Baldwin of Flanders sat upon the imperial throne, his empire began to shrink, not in territory, but in loyalty. The very nobles who had cheered his coronation soon turned on each other. There were too many claims, too few spoils. Petty barons grew bold in the provinces. Mercenary captains demanded payment in land. The empire Baldwin ruled was more dream than dominion, an illusion painted over smouldering ruins. In the countryside, Latin garrisons held crumbling fortresses surrounded by hostile peasants. Greek villages refused Latin law. Greek priests defied Latin bishops. What the Crusaders could not understand, they tried to silence. What they could not silence, they tried to destroy. But Byzantium had never been a place conquered with swords alone. It lived in ritual, in language, in icons passed hand to hand. And it would not die quietly. In the city of Nicaea, Theodore Lascaris understood this. A soldier scholar, he moved quickly to gather the remnants of Byzantium into something more than nostalgia. He forged alliances, reorganized the military, and declared a new empire not in defiance, but in inheritance. The Empire of Nicaea would not just survive, it would one day return, in Epirus. Michael Komnenos did the same. Though more warlord than statesman, his armies reclaimed swaths of land in the Western Balkans and in distant Trebizond on the Black Sea, a third spark lit. Each of these exile courts claimed the legacy of Constantinople, but none forgot who had taken the city, none forgave. Back in Constantinople, Baldwin faced more than just rebellion from within. In 1205, barely a year after his coronation, he rode north to face a Bulgarian uprising, believing it would be a simple matter. It was not. At the Battle of Adrianople, the Latin forces were crushed. Baldwin was captured, chained, and eventually executed, his skull later fashioned into a goblet by his enemies. The emperor was dead. His empire, still young, had lost its head. In his place rose Henry of Flanders, Baldwin's brother, a man of more tolerance, more diplomacy. He tried to rule wisely. He spared churches. He placated nobles. But he ruled an empire already poisoned by its birth. Henry's reign slowed the decay. It did not stop it. And far from the throne, the exiles gathered strength. As the 13th century unfolded, the Latin Empire clung to life like a dying man grasping at shadows. Emperor Henry of Flanders ruled with moderation and pragmatism, attempting to bridge the divide between occupier and occupied. He granted concessions to the Greeks, preserved Orthodox churches where he could, and kept his Latin lords from openly devouring each other for a time. But even Henry could not change what the Latin Empire was at its core, a conquest, not a covenant. The people never loved him, they only tolerated him. And when he died in 1216, rumoured to have been poisoned by his own Latin allies, the empire descended once again into infighting. Venice, which had gained so much from the sack, no longer cared for the empire's survival, only for its trade routes. The French barons warred among themselves. The clergy sent from Rome grew increasingly isolated, surrounded by rituals and languages they barely understood. And the soldiers, the backbone of the conquest, were underpaid, underfed, and beginning to desert. All the while, the exile empires of the Greeks were evolving from refugees into powers. Nicaea flourished under Theodore the Firm and his successors. Schools reopened, new churches were built, laws were reformed, trade resumed through Anatolian routes. A new generation of Greeks was raised not in shame, but in resolve. They studied the past not just as glory but as responsibility. They saw Constantinople as destiny. Epirus remained fierce, though divided. Its rulers harboured their own imperial dreams, sometimes clashing with Nicaea. But even in rivalry, they shared a common vow: the Latins would not keep the city forever. By 1220, the Latin Empire held little more than Constantinople and a few coastal fortresses. It was surrounded, isolated, and increasingly irrelevant. The great dream of unifying the church under Latin rule had failed. Instead, it had split the Christian world more deeply than ever. And across the empire, strange rumours began to surface. Whispers of visions of emperors rising from the sea, of the double-headed eagle flying once more over the Golden Dome. In monasteries and markets, old men spoke of a day when the rightful heirs would return, not as invaders, but as restorers. In Nicaea, those whispers became strategy. And in Constantinople, the Latin lords began to look over their shoulders. They had built their empire on ashes. Now the wind was changing. The Latin Empire, once declared as the salvation of the East, had become its embarrassment. Its territory was reduced to a threadbare strip of land, its treasury hollowed by years of corruption and war. And its leaders, now third-generation Western lords born in the East, were rulers without subjects, kings without crowns. The city of Constantinople, once the beating heart of a millennium-old empire, was now a fortress of unease. Its streets remained broken, its churches, stripped of their icons, echoed with unfamiliar Latin rites. And outside the walls, the world had moved on. In Nicaea, a new emperor rose, John III, Ducas Vatatzes. He was not a warlord in the mold of his predecessors, but a statesman measured, educated, and relentless. He saw the future not as a battlefield, but as a chessboard. Under his rule, the Empire of Nicaea blossomed. Roads were rebuilt, trade with the East expanded. Greek culture and Orthodox liturgy surged back to prominence. But most importantly, Vatatzes worked quietly, steadily, toward one goal: the recovery of Constantinople. He forged alliances with Bulgaria, negotiated with Italian city-states, and laid the foundations of a war that would be won not by brute force, but by strategy, patience, and timing. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, fear seeped into the ruling class. There were fewer Latin children playing in the squares. The nobles sent their heirs westward for safety. The local populace, still overwhelmingly Greek, grew bolder in their disdain. Every procession of Latin clergy was met with silence. Every tax collector returned with less than before. The empire was dying not by rebellion, but by neglect. The people no longer cared who ruled. They were waiting for the end, and the end was coming. In 1258, a boy emperor took the Nicaean throne, Michael VIII Palaiologos, ambitious, ruthless, and charismatic. Michael understood that history does not wait for the perfect moment, it must be seized. He revived old alliances, he raised new armies, and he looked not just to restore the city, but to revive the Roman dream. He did not see Constantinople as a relic, he saw it as a crown, and he would wear it. By 1260, the noose around Constantinople had grown tight. From the west, the papacy's interest in supporting the Latin Empire had dwindled. Too many crusades, too little glory. From the east, Michael VIII, Palaiologos of Nicaea, had unified factions, outmaneuvered rivals, and marshalled not only soldiers, but legitimacy. He styled himself as the heir to Constantine, not by blood, but by fate. The Latin Empire, now barely more than a garrison, had few cards left to play. Emperor Baldwin II pawned the empire's most sacred relic, the crown of thorns itself, to finance mercenaries. He was so impoverished, he reportedly sold off the lead roofing of the royal palace for coin. His court was a shell. His army, a fraction of its former size. His allies, unreliable at best. Michael VIII saw the moment arrive in 1261. He dispatched a small force under the command of General Alexios Strategopoulos, not to assault Constantinople, but to observe, to gauge its defenses. But fate intervened. When Strategopoulos approached the city's western walls, he learned that most of the Latin garrison had marched out to raid Nicaean territory. The city was vulnerable, and so, on the night of July 24th, 1261, under cover of darkness, through a forgotten gate, Nicaean soldiers crept into Constantinople. There was no great battle, no pitched siege, no heroic defense. The Latin Empire fell with barely a sound. By morning, the double-headed eagle of Byzantium once more flew over the city. Baldwin II fled to the harbour, abandoning his crown. Michael VIII entered days later in triumph, not with vengeance, but with tears. He prostrated himself before the altar of Hagia Sophia, kissing the stones, weeping with the clergy, while the city watched in silence. The exiles had returned. The empire had been reborn, not whole, not as it once was, but alive. From its ashes, Byzantium stood again, battered, diminished, yet radiant in its defiance. And the Latin Empire, it vanished, a 13-year aberration, a ghost of conquest buried beneath the weight of memory and marble. But the scars remained. East and West had not been reconciled. They had been severed forever. The morning after Michael VIII entered Constantinople, the city did not erupt in jubilation. It exhaled. The streets were quiet not with fear, but with awe. For 57 years, the Greeks of the city had prayed, wept, and waited. They had watched the cross atop Hagia Sophia replaced by one unfamiliar, heard mass sung in foreign tongues, and buried loved ones beneath alien banners. Now, those banners lay in the dust. The Latin presence was over. But the city they reclaimed was not the one they had lost. Its churches had been looted. Its libraries were bare. Its sacred icons had vanished into Venetian markets and French cathedrals. The once gleaming mosaics were faded, scorched. The palace of the emperors was a hollow shell. And yet, as the liturgy of the Orthodox Church echoed once more beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, as incense rose from Greek altars, as the hymns of Byzantium returned to its streets, the people felt something deeper than triumph. They felt resurrection. Michael VIII did not waste the moment. He declared a festival of purification. Priests cleansed the holy spaces. Icons were restored. Processions wound through the streets, honoring saints and martyrs. The emperor commissioned restorations, scholarships, embassies. He knew that the Latin conquest had been not just a military disaster, but a spiritual wound, and it had to be healed with more than swords. But outside the city, the reaction was mixed. In the Latin West, the loss of Constantinople stung like betrayal. Venice fumed, their trade privileges were threatened. The papacy recoiled. France mourned the collapse of its eastern kingdom. Crusading orders reeled, uncertain of their purpose. For the second time in a century, the holy ambitions of the West had ended not in Jerusalem, but in humiliation. And in the East, among the Byzantines, the victory was not without ghosts. The Latin occupation had not only divided faiths, it had fragmented the empire itself. The lands of the once unified Byzantium were now scattered. Epirus, Trebizond, Bulgaria, and the Seljuk Turks all stood in the way of true imperial restoration. Michael VIII knew that reclaiming the throne was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. But for now, Constantinople was Byzantine once more, and the world, for better or worse, had changed. Forever, for decades, Constantinople had worn a borrowed face. Under Latin rule, the city had been dressed in Western forms, Romanesque facades, papal decrees, French etiquette, and Venetian law, but it had never fit. Like armor forged for another night, it chafed the skin of Byzantium's soul. The Greek people had endured it with clenched teeth, never forgetting the liturgies that once filled their churches, the emperors who had walked their halls, the golden mosaics that had shone like starlight before they were stripped and sold. So when Michael VIII Palaiologos stepped through the gates in 1261, not as a conqueror, but as a restorer, the very stones of the city seemed to remember. But this restoration was not a return to glory. It was a reckoning. The Byzantines now ruled a half-ruined city, surrounded by enemies. Its population had dwindled. Its economy was hollow. The empire they reclaimed was not an empire at all, but a crown with no body. Michael VIII faced rebellions from rival Greek claimants, invasions from Bulgarians, pressure from the Pope, and the ever-lurking presence of the Italian maritime powers who had once plundered the city, and now eyed it with new suspicion. Even so, he pushed forward, rebuilding the army, reopening schools, re-establishing the Orthodox Church in its seat of power. Yet the scars of Latin rule were not so easily erased. For decades after the reconquest, Greek children were still taught not just of the glory of Byzantium, but of its fall, its desecration, its betrayal. Latin Christians, once seen as brothers in faith, were now seen by many as wolves in clerical robes. The sack of 1204 had not only cost a city, it had cost trust, unity, and perhaps any hope of reconciliation between Eastern and Western Christianity. And while the banners of Byzantium flew again over Hagia Sophia, the empire they crowned was smaller, poorer, and more fragile than ever before. The flame had not died. But it flickered now in a world that no longer bent to its will. The ghost of the Latin Empire haunted every negotiation, every alliance, every dream of resurgence, because Byzantium had survived, but it had been changed forever. Even after the banners of Byzantium returned to the ramparts of Constantinople, something in the city remained unsettled. The Latin occupation had not only broken buildings, it had cracked something deeper, something sacred. For the Greeks, faith had always been woven into stone, into ceremony, into language. But for more than 50 years, the sacred rhythm of their world had been interrupted. Children had been born into Latin rites. Weddings were officiated by priests who could not recite the liturgy in Greek. Icons of the Theotokos were replaced by foreign saints unknown to the people. Even in victory, these fractures remained. Michael VIII worked to mend them. He funded churches, reinstated Orthodox bishops, reconsecrated holy sites. But spiritual scars do not vanish with ritual. The memory of the desecration lingered. The silence of empty monasteries, the sight of plundered relics in foreign lands, these things could not be undone. And so the city moved forward, but never forgot. Nor did the West. The re-establishment of Byzantine control over Constantinople was seen in Rome not as a restoration, but as a usurpation. The Pope, furious at the loss of his proxy empire, excommunicated Michael VIII. The rift between Catholic and Orthodox deepened once more. Any hope of healing the Great Schism died with the dream of Latin unity. Elsewhere, empires observed the fall of the Latin regime with calculation. Venice mourned its privileges, but pivoted to commerce. Genoa, newly allied with Michael, rushed to fill the vacuum, securing trade routes and naval posts. The Seljuk Turks and the rising powers of Anatolia watched with interest. They saw the weakness beneath the golden eagle. They knew Byzantium had returned, but it was no longer untouchable. Michael VIII had lit the lamp of revival, but he ruled in the shadow of fire. For every temple he rebuilt, there was a province lost. For every icon restored, a new threat stirred beyond the walls. The Byzantines had regained their throne, but they stood atop a trembling world. Constantinople had been reclaimed, but the Byzantines who walked its streets after 1261 did so with the cautious reverence of mourners returning to a desecrated tomb. The sacred had been violated. Every corner of the city whispered of the Latin presence. Ruins stood where churches had once sung with golden hymns. Palaces once filled with imperial ceremony were charred and looted. The cisterns ran lower, the libraries thinner. Knowledge and relics had fled westward, carried off not by unbelievers, but by fellow Christians. That betrayal lingered in the bones of the city. Michael VIII understood that his victory was not just a military triumph, but a spiritual burden. He poured resources into restoring Hagia Sophia, reopened schools of philosophy and theology, and welcomed back scholars from exile. But even as incense rose once more beneath the dome, the people knew that something had changed forever. Byzantium was not what it had been. Its people were older now, less confident, more bitter. The empire, once a shining axis between East and West, had become a survivor, glorious in memory, vulnerable in reality. The The dream of universal empire was gone. The Byzantines no longer ruled the world, they endured it. Outside the walls, old enemies grew restless. Latin lords who had escaped swore revenge. Venice seethed, the papacy plotted, and the Turkish beyliks, fractured but expanding, cast their eyes toward the weakened frontier. Michael VIII had recovered the throne. But to keep it, he would have to play a new game, one of diplomacy, compromise, and often submission. Byzantium would never again be an empire of unchallenged power. It would survive by maneuver, not might. It would trade territory for time, autonomy for peace. It was no longer the center of the world. It was the edge of survival. And yet, in that survival, there remained a strange kind of strength. The Byzantines had endured sack, exile, betrayal, and still they sang. Still they prayed. Still they crowned emperors and lit candles to the saints. The Latin Empire had ruled for 57 years, but Byzantium had returned. And though its body was frail, its soul was iron. Even as the banners of Byzantium fluttered once again above Constantinople's gates, the empire walked like a revenant, a ghost, wearing its own skin. To outsiders, the restoration seemed triumphant. The emperor rode in state. The choirs of Hagia Sophia sang once more in Greek. Ambassadors bowed in the reformed court. But for the people of the city, for those who had survived the sack, endured occupation, and now lived in the aftermath, every street corner was a memorial, every tower a reminder of what had been stolen. For 57 years, the soul of the empire had existed in exile, dispersed across Nicaea, Epirus, Trebizond, and the winds of rumor. Now that it had returned, it did not find the same world. The unity that had defined Constantinople before 1204 was gone. The exile states, once fueled by the hope of return, were not eager to kneel again. Some would never accept Palaiologos rule. Michael VIII knew this. He ruled as much by manipulation as by majesty. He bought peace with bribes, secured alliances through marriage, and offered oaths with fingers crossed behind his back. He had recovered the throne not to restore the past, but to invent a future to keep the Byzantine idea breathing a little longer. And yet, despite the decay, despite the cracks in marble and trust alike, something endured. The liturgy still echoed through the domes. The scent of incense still curled up the apse. The icons, though scarred, still watched over the faithful. And in the hearts of its people, Byzantium was still more than an empire. It was a covenant, a civilization that believed itself chosen not to rule, but to remember, to carry forward the flame of Rome, not through conquest, but through endurance. It had been plundered, it had been shamed, but it had not been erased. And though it would never again reach the heights of Basil or Justinian, it would stand for 2 more centuries, its crown dented, its robe frayed, but its gaze unbroken, watching history shift around it, waiting for the final chapter. In the stillness after the storm, Constantinople slept, not the peaceful sleep of the innocent, but the restless slumber of a city that had dreamed too deeply and been wounded in its dreaming. The nights were quiet, but not silent. Somewhere, always, there was the sound of scaffolds rising, of hammers rebuilding, of monks chanting ancient hymns into the dark. The people walked carefully, not just over broken stones, but over history itself. Every step in Constantinople was a step through layers of time, Roman ambition, Christian devotion, imperial splendor, Latin fire, and now, something else, something humbler, wiser, perhaps, or maybe simply tired. Michael VIII. Palaiologos sat the throne as emperor of a restored Byzantium. But he knew the truth. What had returned was not the same empire that had been lost. The city had been reshaped by trauma, like iron tempered in flame. And though the gates now bore the double-headed eagle once more, They also bore scars that no gold leaf could cover. The relics were gone. The treasury was hollow. The lands divided. The great fleets scattered. But still, the city stood. Still, the bells rang. Still, a people called themselves Roman in a world that barely remembered what that meant. The Latin Empire had come and gone, a violent parenthesis in a much older story. And while its ashes cooled in the shadow of a resurgent Byzantium, they left behind a permanent question. What had been gained? What had been lost? And what, if anything, could ever truly be recovered? These questions would echo through the next chapters of history. But for now, for one quiet moment, Constantinople stood once more. Not as queen of the world, but as survivor. And that, in a century of fire, was its own kind of victory. It was said that when the Greeks returned to Hagia Sophia, the icons wept, not with joy, but with sorrow. Because though the altar had been restored, though the chants once more rose in the tongue of Chrysostom and Basil, the soul of the city had been altered forever. The Byzantines were not reclaiming a city, they were burying an era and trying to resurrect something half-remembered and deeply wounded. For the peasants of Thrace and the merchants of Galata, the change in power meant little. Taxes would still come. Soldiers would still march. But for the monks, the scribes, the mothers lighting candles for sons lost in the Latin wars, this moment was sacred. It was the return of continuity, a chance not to forget, but to believe again. Yet belief alone could not hold an empire. Michael VIII soon discovered that the Byzantium he had inherited was a mosaic of illusions, glorious to behold from a distance, fragile when touched. The army was undermanned, the navy nearly non-existent, the countryside exhausted, and the court. The court was a nest of whispers. He spent his reign fending off invasions, appeasing Western kings, suppressing rival Greek claimants, and even blinding a child, John IV Lascaris, the legitimate heir of Nicaea, to consolidate power. His crown had been won by strategy, but kept by cruelty. And every time he gazed upon the skyline of Constantinople, he must have wondered, was the city worth the price it had been retaken, but never truly healed. In the decades that followed, Constantinople would become less a capital and more a relic. The empire it ruled was narrow, coastal, and always on the defensive. The Latins had stolen more than gold. They had stolen time, the time Byzantium needed to adapt, to strengthen, to endure. What remained was haunted brilliance. Scholars returned. Theological schools reopened. Diplomats danced a constant game of delay. But the empire's walls, like its people, were aging. Each year felt like borrowed breath. Still, they held. Still, they prayed. Still, they wrote history. Because the Byzantines believed in one truth above all. So long as Constantinople stood, Rome had not fallen, even if it no longer ruled the world, even if the world no longer cared. In the years after the reconquest of Constantinople, a strange transformation took hold within Byzantium, not imposed by decree, but by the quiet evolution of a people learning to live with loss. The Byzantines had once seen themselves as the true inheritors of Rome, emperors of the world, custodians of a universal church, guardians of civilization. But the events of 1204 had shattered that illusion. No longer did they speak of reconquering lost provinces in Italy or the Levant. No longer did they boast of a world that turned on their axis. Now they whispered of preservation, of identity, of outlasting rather than expanding. It was as if the city itself had changed the shape of its soul. Constantinople became a fortress of memory. Its libraries, though diminished, still preserved the works of Homer, Plato, and the Church Fathers. Its churches became sanctuaries not only of worship, but of resistance to time, to foreign tongues, to the creeping tide of the West and East alike. In its narrow streets, a kind of defiant humility took root. The people no longer looked outward with the eyes of conquerors, but inward with the determination of caretakers. Michael VIII Palaiologos, for all his political ruthlessness, sensed this shift. He funded scholars. He cultivated alliances with Italian maritime powers like Genoa, not to reclaim old lands, but to safeguard what remained. He negotiated fiercely with the papacy, not for domination, but for protection. And though he dreamed of empire, he ruled a memory. The Latin Empire had lasted 57 years, but in that time, it had fundamentally redefined the balance between East and West. The schism between Orthodox and Catholic was now more than theological. It was cultural, emotional, ancestral. Crusaders were no longer seen as misguided brothers, but as enemies cloaked in cross and greed. The sack of 1204 had not merely defiled a city, it had broken communion. Byzantium emerged from the ashes not as a universal empire, but as a sacred remnant, a guardian of a fading flame, a voice chanting in Greek against the roar of a world that had moved on. And for the people who still walked its marble colonnades, who still kissed ancient icons in candlelight, that was enough. They did not dream of dominion. They dreamt of endurance. By the end of the 13th century, the Byzantines no longer measured greatness by the breadth of their borders, but by the longevity of their spirit. The old dream of empire, the reconquest of Italy, the reuniting of Christendom under one Orthodox crown, had crumbled in the fires of Latin occupation. But in its place grew something quieter, stranger, more enduring as civilizational defiance. Byzantium would no longer seek to lead the world. It would seek to outlast it. In Constantinople, this was felt everywhere. The schools taught not politics, but theology. The mosaics that once glorified imperial power now glowed with more spiritual weight. Christ Pantocrator, not emperors, watched from the domes. Even the liturgy grew longer, more poetic, almost mournful in its beauty, as if to wrap the city in words against the cold of history's winds. To the outside world, Byzantium became a riddle. To Western Europe, it was no longer an empire, but a stubborn relic clinging to medieval grandeur. To the Turks and Bulgars, it was a city of riches and stories, still tempting, still coveted. To its own people, however, it became something sacred, less a government than a testimony. They had lost so much, but not their name. They were Romans still. Even as the Latin princes returned to Europe, defeated and disgraced, the memory of what they had done in 1204 remained a wound that never healed. And in that wound, the Byzantines found identity. They could forgive the Persians, the Arabs, the Seljuks, for they were foreign, but the Latins, the Christians, their betrayal had been intimate, it had been theological, and it had left a bitterness that would stain Orthodox Catholic relations forever. So while Constantinople stood walled, weary, wounded, it remained the last outpost of an ancient promise. It would not fall again easily. And when it did, if it did, it would not be because it had been forgotten. It would be because the world no longer had room for the old gods, the old emperors, the old dreams. But until that hour, Byzantium endured and remembered. Resurrection and Reverberations. When the smoke cleared and the double-headed eagle flew once more over Constantinople, the world did not pause. No trumpet sounded in Rome. No chronicle in Paris closed its page. To the west, the recovery of Byzantium in 1261 was a footnote. To the east, it was resurrection. But not the kind that restores it, was the kind that remembers. And memory, when shaped by fire, becomes prophecy. The Byzantines had endured what no empire before them, had a death by Christian hands and a rebirth by wounded faith. The sack of 1204 had not only shattered the city, it had stained the soul of Christendom. Western knights, sworn to serve the cross, had desecrated the greatest cathedral in Christendom. They had looted the tombs of emperors, melted down icons of saints, and spilled blood at altars built in the days of Constantine. The Orthodox world would never forget. The schism between East and West, once a theological fissure, was now a canyon lined with bones and betrayal. Priests no longer debated over words in creeds. They pointed to corpses and burned manuscripts. In Hagia Sophia, the liturgy resumed, but it was a liturgy shadowed by bitterness. Every Kyrie Eleison was a lament for the memory of 1,000 violated sanctuaries. And yet, Byzantium survived. It was not the survival of glory, but of witness. In monasteries across the empire, monks copied not just scripture, but history's accounts of the sack, of the exile, of the slow return. They turned trauma into narrative. They wrote with ink and tears, casting the Latin West as Judas cloaked in armor. And in doing so, they gave shape to a new Byzantine identity, one forged not in conquest, but in refusal to disappear. Michael VIII's triumph in 1261 had been military, yes, but it was also metaphysical. It declared that empires could bleed and still believe. It taught that faith could be driven from its altar, but not from the hearts of its people. And it carved into the Byzantine consciousness a role far beyond politics, to be the last city standing, the last guardian of the Roman flame, the last voice of a world that would not go quietly. But even as the city healed, the empire around it continued to shrink. Seljuk Turks advanced across Anatolia. Italian merchants schemed for trade dominance. The Black Sea routes grew dangerous, and from the Latin West, there came no apology, only silence, followed by indifference. The world had changed, and so had Byzantium. It was no longer a crown reaching toward heaven. It was a candle burning against time. Even in its resurrection, Byzantium found no rest. Michael VIII had reclaimed the Queen of Cities, but the Byzantine Empire he now ruled was a pale echo of its past grandeur. Once a titan straddling continents, it now clung to a crescent of coastal lands. Its reach weakened, its riches drained. And worse, its enemies had multiplied while its friends had withered. To the west, the papacy, humiliated by the collapse of its Latin vassal state, regarded Michael with hostility. Rome had hoped to transform Constantinople into a Western bastion, a shining symbol of Catholic dominance in the East. Instead, it had been cast out, its patriarchs driven away, its banners torn down. In retaliation, the Pope excommunicated Michael twice, first in 1267, then again in 1277, after failed attempts to force a reunion of churches under papal authority. These excommunications, rather than isolating Byzantium, only deepened its resolve. The Orthodox Church, having survived occupation, emerged with a hardened identity. It was no longer merely an institution of sacraments and scripture. It had become a fortress of memory, a living archive of suffering and endurance. Its priests were no longer only spiritual guides, but custodians of a wounded people. Icons were painted not only to honor saints, but to remember those who had bled for the faith. Every liturgy became a subtle defiance of the Latin yoke. Yet the Byzantines could not afford to exist in bitterness alone. Michael VIII sought pragmatic solutions. He negotiated treaties with Genoa to counterbalance Venetian hostility. He attempted church reunification not out of conviction, but necessity, hoping to gain Western military support against new threats. But each attempt drove a wedge deeper into his people. The clergy accused him of selling the soul of Byzantium. The monasteries denounced him, even within his court. Loyalty grew thin. Unity had been reclaimed at sword point, but consensus had not. To the east, the Seljuk Turks continued their relentless push. Though fractured by Mongol invasions, they tested Byzantine defences along the Anatolian frontier. In the north, the Bulgars watched Constantinople with old hunger, and beyond the sea. Venice bided its time, waiting for the empire to falter once more. Byzantium, though reborn, stood encircled, and so the empire turned inward. It poured its limited wealth into preserving what it could, its libraries, its churches, its scholars. Constantinople became a beacon not of power, but of continuity. While Paris and London raced toward the Renaissance, Byzantium acted as a vessel of the ancient. It preserved texts no longer read in the West. It kept alive liturgies, philosophies, and memories discarded elsewhere. In its narrow streets and candlelit chapels, history breathed. This, perhaps, was Byzantium's true resurrection. Not a revival of legions and provinces, but the refusal to forget, the determination to remain, the conviction that even a broken empire, if faithful to itself, could still be immortal. And so, while the world moved on, Constantinople stood as both relic and warning, a city that had been betrayed by its own faith, reclaimed by its own people, and now endured not through strength, but through remembrance. Its walls, cracked and patched, still held, its towers still reached, its voice, though weary, still sang, and in that song, all of Christendom could hear a distant echo. This is what happens when faith becomes empire, and this is what remains when empire becomes a prayer. In the shadows of Hagia Sophia's dome, long after the last Latin had fled and the Greek liturgy returned, a different war began, one not of swords, but of meaning. The Orthodox world, fractured yet vindicated, now had to define itself not just in opposition to Catholicism, but in affirmation of what it had preserved. The trauma of 1204 had seared into the Byzantine soul a theological certainty that true faith could survive fire, exile, and desecration not because of wealth or armies, but because of its unbroken liturgical memory. The churches of the West might wield power, but Byzantium held tradition. This conviction transformed the empire into more than a state. It became a monastery with walls, a bastion of holy time. Pilgrims no longer came to Constantinople for glory. They came for witness. They came to walk beneath mosaics that had survived conquest. They came to hear hymns that had once defied crusaders. They came to see the last flickering lamplight of a world older than their kings. But outside those walls, the world was changing. In Rome, new popes no longer wept for the loss of the Latin Empire they prepared for other crusades, against heretics in France, against Moors in Spain, against pagans in the Baltic. The crusading spirit, once born in the dream of Jerusalem, had become a mechanism of European ambition, and Constantinople's fall and recovery to many, it was an inconvenient legend best left buried beneath newer myths of knightly virtue. To the rising Italian republics, Byzantium was a trade partner to be manipulated, a relic to be circled like wolves. To the Mongols, whose riders thundered across the eastern steppes, it was a distant city of gold crosses and old men. To the Turks, it was unfinished business. But to the Orthodox faithful from Serbia to Georgia, from Thessalonica to the Black Sea, it remained the beacon, the city of Constantine, the second Rome, the living altar of their cultural and spiritual identity. They sang its praises not in conquest, but in candlelight, and within its embattled walls, monks and mystics began to speak of prophecy, of a last emperor who would arise in the city's final hour, of a moment when the sacred flame of Byzantium would flicker its last and pass into legend, of a church that would fall but rise again, in spirit, in truth, in a distant age. These prophecies would echo for centuries. They would give hope to Orthodox peasants living under foreign rule. They would haunt the minds of czars and patriarchs in distant lands. They would whisper beneath the surface of every cathedral built in memory of the Queen of Cities. Because Byzantium, once an empire, had become something harder to kill, an idea, a longing, a ghost in gold. And though the world no longer feared its armies, it never quite stopped dreaming of its soul. By the mid-14th century, Byzantium was no longer an empire in the conventional sense. It was a shrine with walls, an echo with a crown, a city guarding the embers of a world that had already passed into history. Yet in that frailty, there was something awe-inspiring like a candle burning upright in the face of a storm. The Palaiologos dynasty, though weary and often divided, continued to rule over the city. Its emperors walked beneath mosaics older than their lineage, sat on thrones worn smooth by the hands of forgotten rulers, and every morning, as the sun touched the domes of Hagia Sophia, they oversaw a realm that had become more symbol than state. Outside Constantinople, the world had shifted. The Ottoman Turks, no longer a scattered band of frontier warriors, were rising in Anatolia like a storm. Their crescent banners flew closer and closer to the Bosphorus. Towns fell, trade faltered, and the old buffer zones once held by allies or vassals crumbled like sandbanks before a tide. And yet, within the capital, life persisted. The monasteries remained filled. Processions wound through narrow streets, singing of saints and martyrs. Diplomats came and went, some bearing hopes of aid from the West, others bringing only the chill of delay and deceit. A few emperors, desperate, journeyed to Rome themselves. They bowed to popes, signed decrees of church union, even attended Latin masses begging for help that rarely came. For their efforts, they returned home to riots, to accusations of heresy, to a people who would rather fall Orthodox than stand Catholic. This was Byzantium's great paradox in its final years, surrounded by enemies, weakened by politics, abandoned by allies yet still unwilling to surrender its soul. It was no longer the Rome of armies. It was the Rome of prayer. And in those final decades, as shadows lengthened across the empire's once great provinces, it began to feel like a city waiting for martyrdom. Some chroniclers sensed it. They wrote not of victory, but of witness, not of conquest to come, but of a death that might sanctify the whole civilization. And still, the bells rang. Still, the liturgy filled the domes. Still, the emperor walked in procession, flanked by candles and chants, beneath stars that no longer bent to his rule. The world had changed, but Byzantium refused to change with it, not out of arrogance, but out of faith. Faith that even if the city fell, the spirit it carried would not. As the 15th century dawned, Constantinople stood as a city suspended between worlds, between memory and mortality, between sanctity and siege. Its walls, cracked and ancient, had withstood everything from crusaders to earthquakes, but they could not stop time. Time, more than armies, was Byzantium's final conqueror. And yet, within those walls, the empire lived on, if not in dominance, then in defiance. The streets of the city still echoed with the rhythm of liturgy, not command. Choirs sang in Greek beneath domes once struck by Latin swords. Old men taught Homer and Basil to children in candlelit cloisters. Fishermen cast nets into the Bosphorus as they had done for 1,000 years, beneath a skyline shaped by emperors now long dust. Life persisted not with the arrogance of empire, but with the reverence of remembrance. And yet, always, there was the looming shadow of the Ottomans. They were no longer a distant threat. They were at the gates, literally and figuratively. Town after town had fallen. Adrianople had become Edirne. Turkish cavalry patrolled what had once been Byzantine farmland. The empire, once a continent-spanning titan, now controlled little more than Constantinople itself, a few islands, and scattered fortresses that still dared fly the eagle of Byzantium. The emperors John V, Manuel II, Constantine V wore crowns that weighed more in symbolism than in sovereignty. They negotiated with popes, with Hungarians, with Venetians. They traveled to foreign courts, speaking of ancient honor and Christian unity, seeking ships, men, coin, anything. And too often, they returned with promises, with condolences, with prayers but no armies. In desperation, church union was attempted again at the Council of Florence in 1439. The Greeks agreed to papal terms, swallowed theological pride in exchange for theoretical support. But back in Constantinople, the people erupted. They would not trade their faith for foreign swords. Better the turban of the Turk, many whispered, than the tiara of the Pope. It was not blasphemy, it was exhaustion. For the Byzantines had already been betrayed by fellow Christians once in 1204. They had already seen Latin banners over Hagia Sophia. They remembered what church union had brought them: sack, slaughter, desecration. They would not be fooled again. They would not barter the Eucharist for artillery. And so, they prepared to die as they had lived, not as an empire of conquest, but as a church with walls. In 1453, when Mehmed II, the young and brilliant Sultan of the Ottomans, gathered his forces around the Theodosian walls, it was not merely an army that stood across from Constantinople. It was the future: gunpowder, cannons, new language, new rule, and inside the city, fewer than 8,000 defenders: Greeks, Genoese, some mercenaries, some monks, stood between the past and its eclipse. For 53 days they held, the bells rang, the priests prayed. Emperor Constantine V donned the armor of his ancestors, not as a conqueror, but as a martyr in waiting. He fought in the breach, beside his men, refusing escape, refusing surrender. And when the walls finally gave way, and the Ottoman tide surged through the streets, he vanished into legend, his body never definitively found. His name sealed into myth. Some say he still rides beneath the city, waiting. But the truth is, he never had to. For on that day, when Constantinople fell, Byzantium did not die, it transformed. It became memory, relic, prophecy. It became the echo in Russian churches, where Tsars would call themselves Caesars, Tsars inheritors of the Second Rome. It became the lament in Balkan ballads, the script in Orthodox scripture, the icon in distant monasteries, where candles still flicker before saints painted in the style of the Queen of Cities. And it became the question no history has fully answered. How did a civilization die so slowly, so beautifully, and yet still breathe in the bones of the world? Byzantium was gone, and Byzantium was everywhere. Not as power, but as soul. Even centuries after the fall of Constantinople, Byzantium refused to vanish. Its marble may have crumbled, its banners torn down, its emperors buried beneath layers of dust and conquest. But the idea of Byzantium lingered like incense in a ruined chapel. It was never truly a kingdom of earth. It had always aimed higher, a kingdom that reached between the stones of Rome and the heavens of Jerusalem, bridging theology and empire, prophecy and politics. In Orthodox hearts, Byzantium became the mother of a forgotten glory. In Russian halls, it was a sacred inheritance, the Third Rome, rising from the ashes of the Second. In Western memory, it lingered as a ghost, a civilization too complex to conquer, too spiritual to understand, too enduring to ignore. Even in its defeat, it shaped victors. Ottoman sultans called themselves Kaisers I Rum, Caesars of Rome, conscious inheritors of Byzantine titles. They studied its bureaucracies, adopted its architecture, and perhaps unknowingly carried forward the ghost of the very thing they had destroyed. And in the East, among the faithful, every dome raised in Byzantium's shadow became a vigil, every icon a witness, every liturgy a resurrection. The empire had fallen, but the light it cast still shone across the centuries. In the end, Byzantium was not simply an empire. It was a memory that refused to die, a story written not in stone, but in spirit, and as long as hymns echo beneath domes and candles flicker before icons, as long as there are people who speak of Hagia Sophia with awe and sorrow, as long as the name Constantinople can still stir something sacred, Byzantium endures. Not in maps, but in the marrow of faith. And that is a victory no army could ever conquer. Long after the last emperor fell, long after the crescent rose above the dome of Hagia Sophia, the memory of Byzantium refused to fade. In mountain monasteries of the Balkans, Orthodox monks continued to illuminate manuscripts in the Byzantine hand. In Russia, as Moscow grew in power, its leaders proclaimed themselves heirs to the Eastern Roman tradition, calling their city the Third Rome. They wore robes fashioned in imitation of Constantinopolitan courtly splendor. Their priests sang hymns once heard under the mosaics of Hagia Sophia. Even in the Catholic West, where memory of the Orthodox world had often been clouded by rivalry, artists, architects, and philosophers found in Byzantine art a depth of mystery and a style of sacred beauty that could not be ignored. Icons survived, styles traveled. The spirit of Byzantium infiltrated Renaissance visions even as its theology remained distant. But Byzantium's true legacy was not material. It was the idea that faith and civilization could be one, that the divine could be reflected in how a city was built, how a liturgy was sung, how a people endured even in ruin. For the Orthodox world, the fall of Constantinople was not only the end of an empire, but a spiritual crucifixion. And like the faith it so zealously defended, Byzantium embraced a theology of resurrection. Even in defeat, it witnessed. Even in ashes, it taught. Even in silence, it sang. From the golden mosaics of Ravenna to the wooden churches of Serbia, from the domes of Kiev to the thrones of Muscovy, Byzantium became not a place but a calling, to remember, to preserve, to believe. And perhaps that is why, centuries later, in times of crisis and oppression, people still look eastward, not just to a city, but to an idea that once upon a time, in a place where Europe met Asia, heaven touched earth, and it was called Byzantium. As the centuries passed, the Byzantine Empire faded from maps, but not from minds. It became legend whispered by priests in remote Greek isles, remembered in the chants of Serbian monks, evoked in the golden domes of Russian cathedrals. The empire that had fallen not with a cry, but with a chant, lived on through ritual, memory, and myth. Every Pascha Easter, as Orthodox bells rang out across the Eastern world, it was Constantinople that echoed its liturgy, its cadence, its defiant hope in the face of ruin. Every time a bishop swung incense before an iconostasis, he continued a choreography shaped under domes once blackened by Latin fire. Every time a child was taught to cross themselves right to left, it was the shadow of Byzantium moving through the generations. It endured in more than spirit, it endured in form. The Orthodox Church, scattered but not broken, continued to shape Eastern Europe's identity. In Bulgaria, Romania, Georgia, and Russia, the Byzantine model of church-state symphony left indelible marks. Emperors became patriarchs. Cities modeled themselves after the new Rome. Even the Ottoman sultans, for all their victories, could not fully erase the city's Christian architecture or its memory. They preserved Hagia Sophia first as a mosque, now a museum. Now again a mosque, not simply out of practicality, but reverence, because even in conquest, they knew what they had captured. A jewel not only of stone, but of civilization. The last heir of a world that once claimed to hold heaven in its streets. In modern times, when nations seek roots, they dig toward Byzantium. Greece, reborn in the 19th century, did not see itself as merely ancient, It called upon Byzantium as its Christian mother, Russia, casting itself as the final defender of orthodoxy, crowned czars and built cathedrals as extensions of the Constantinopolitan legacy. Even the debates of the 20th century about East and West, about power and faith, about unity and identity, echoed those old tensions that Byzantium had long embodied. Was the world to be ruled by sword or scripture, by Rome or by Jerusalem? By the many or the one Byzantium had lived those questions. It had suffered for them. It had fallen beneath their weight. And yet, in doing so, it became the answer to a deeper question. What is civilization, if not the stories we choose to guard, even when the walls are gone? The last emperor may have perished in armor. The last churches may have been silenced by conquest, but the soul of Byzantium still speaks in light refracted through gold leaf, in psalms sung before dawn, in the echo of domes that rise toward a heaven both lost and longed for. And so long as someone remembers, somewhere, what was once called the Queen of Cities, it has not fallen. Not truly, not forever. Even into the modern age, the name Constantinople stirs something deeper than geography, it stirs memory. A memory passed not through textbooks, but through liturgy, icon, and whispered prayer. To say Byzantium is to speak of something more than an empire. It is to invoke a dream of a city where heaven touched earth, where the state bowed to the altar, and where faith shaped not just hearts, but horizons. Its fall in 1453 did not extinguish that dream. If anything, it preserved it. In exile, Byzantium became pure, no longer bound by palace intrigue or military campaigns, but distilled into poetry and prophecy, in every village that sang the lament for Constantinople, in every priest who crossed himself before teaching Greek, in every czar who dared call his realm the Third Rome. Byzantium was reborn, not as a state, but as a soul. Even the Ottomans could not silence it. They buried emperors, but could not erase the saints. They transformed Hagia Sophia, but its dome still stood an architectural psalm that neither time nor conquest could unsing. The Turks themselves adopted much from what they conquered: ceremony, court, continuity. In ways both subtle and profound, the Byzantine ghost lingered in their shadow, and in the end, that ghost became a guide for every people seeking to reclaim their history, for every faith clinging to liturgy amidst exile, for every culture determined to remember rather than surrender. Byzantium showed the way, not with swords, but with songs. And though its crown was buried, its hymn was not. In the quiet candlelight of Orthodox chapels, where children still learn the chant of the great doxology, Byzantium lives. In the echo of domes rising over eastern cities, Byzantium breathes. And in the minds of all who refuse to forget, Byzantium reigns, not in gold, not in armies, but in faith made flesh. That is its true resurrection. That is its final reverberation. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked the end of an empire, but not the end of a story. For as long as the bells toll in Eastern churches, as long as icons gaze out from gilded panels, as long as liturgies echo in ancient tongues, the Byzantine spirit endures. It was not a relic consigned to the past. It became a living tradition, guarded not by walls but by faith, in Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, and beyond. Generations carried the rhythms of Byzantine worship like sacred fire. In Russian monasteries blanketed in snow, monks copied out the same gospels once illuminated in the palaces of Constantinople. The empire had died, but its soul had been sown like seed, even in the West, where Byzantium had long been viewed through the lens of rivalry or indifference. The 19th and 20th centuries saw a slow rediscovery. Historians re-examined its complexity. Artists mimicked its mosaics. Architects borrowed its domes, and theologians, haunted by schism, began again to ask what was lost when Rome and Constantinople parted ways. Modern Istanbul, bustling and proud, still wears the bones of Byzantium, the columns of emperors, the aqueducts of engineers, the silhouette of Hagia Sophia they remain. Beneath every tourist's footfall lies 1,000 years of buried empire, and in the hearts of many Greeks, the name Constantinople is spoken not with nostalgia, but with reverence. Byzantium was never just a city, it was an idea, that the sacred could shape the civic, that worship could guide law, that beauty, when fused with belief, could hold off even the end of the world. It failed as a state, but triumphed as a vision, and that vision outlived gunpowder, outlasted crusades, and outshone every banner that ever claimed to replace it. So, in the end, the story of Byzantium is not merely about what fell, it is about what could never be taken. And perhaps that is the greatest victory of all. Empires rise with ambition and fall under the weight of their own glory. But some, like Byzantium, transcend the cycle not by conquest, but by character. For over 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire stood as a crucible where faith and politics, gold and gospel, sword and sacrament coexisted in uneasy brilliance. It knew triumph, betrayal, resurrection, and ruin. It faced enemies from without and rot from within. It was glorified by pilgrims, envied by kings, and finally betrayed by its own brethren. Yet in its darkest hour, Byzantium revealed its true nature. When stripped of its armies and treasures, it was left with its essence belief. Belief in liturgy, in order in the sacred dance between heaven and earth. That belief survived fires, sieges, and even the silence of collapse. And it lives on, not in the form of emperors or palaces, but in the voices of choirs, the light of icons, and the dreams of those who still remember. Because Byzantium was never only a place, it was a prayer in stone, a testament to endurance, a reminder that even when kingdoms fall, their spirit can rise if carried not by weapons, but by will. And so its story ends, not with a final breath, but with a lingering hymn, faint but eternal, forever echoing across the ages.